go, guys, go. Control, go. Falcon, go. Ginseng, go. Econ, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom 1, go. Continue CDI.
Hey guys, we're back in the retro garage today with the Beetle, the Baja Bug, to install the rocker assemblies on the mighty 1911 cc engine. Alright, we're just standing here in front of the 2316 engine, and we're just looking at it because there's an arrow when you're standing, you know, behind the engine, as it were, in a Volkswagen Beetle or a Porsche 356 or 912. When you're standing behind the engine turns clockwise, and it's a good idea to put an arrow on there to just so you don't forget. Okay, what I do is I always lay out the rocker assemblies like kind of like a trial fit build, so I know where all the parts are going before I slam them into the engine, onto the cylinder head. So you can lay them out like that all in a row, and you can make sure they're all nice and clean. And then what you want to do is you want to make sure the rocker blocks, the slot that you see here on the rocker blocks, that slot there points down towards the push rods. Okay, that slot. Now you can get different parts, high performance parts, some from the Type 4 store mainly. I think that's where you get them. A good idea, like these ones have the old spring in the middle here. Okay, so you should really have, just to go through it, you should really have a rocker block, the rocker, one of the spacer shims or spacers on the end of the spring. See, it looks like a shim, but it's like a spacer. And then you have the spring, and then another one of those washer spacers on there like that the spring goes up against. And then you have the rocker, and then you have the block, and of course through the center of all that's the shaft, and you got your adjustment screws and nuts. Okay, some people use, instead of the spring on a high RPM engine through the Type 4 store, they buy a solid aluminum spacer, which is a good idea on a high RPM engine. I don't really go past 5,500 RPM, so I usually have no problem with the springs. But if you're going to go to 6,000 RPM, and then I would suggest getting the spacers, the aluminum spacer. Okay, these are 8mm adjusters. You can also find some engines have 10mm adjusters. So my 2316, for example, has 10mm adjusters. I'll try and hold the other one up to it just so you can kind of see the difference. Okay. Where are we? Okay. Well, you can see the adjuster is a bit smaller on the one in my hand. Okay. I don't know. I don't use any fancy adjustment screws. I just use all the factory German hardware. So I use the 10mm. Guys sometimes like the 8mm because they can put 911 style swivel foot adjusters in place of the screws. I have done that before, but I didn't notice it to be a huge benefit for the way I drive. So again, I just stick with the stock German parts. If you're going to use the 911 style swivel feet adjusters, then you actually have to use shims underneath the rocker blocks to lift the whole rocker assembly higher off the cylinder head to give yourself extra clearance for the added length of the swivel feet adjusters. So you got a lot of shimming to do to make that work. Get the geometry set right. So again, I'm just using stock parts. And then there's a nut that goes on each side as these fit on the studs. Okay, and the two outboard nuts, which this one just has a plain nut right now, but eventually, you know, you can set it up with a plain nut. But when you're going to put your valve covers on, unless you're using the stock valve covers with the bales, you're going to have to actually take that nut off and replace it with one of these, like so, in order to screw your valve covers into So if you're using aluminum valve covers in order to screw your valve covers onto the engine. Okay, today we're back in the garage and we're installing the rockers on the engine. The push rod tubes have been installed, and the push rods are installed as well. I have a ratchet handle placed into the nut to turn the crank over, and so now we are ready to figure out what top dead center is on the number one. So I always install the rockers in the order of operation. So number one rocker assembly goes on number one, and number two, and number three, and number four, so on. So I do them in that order, and then that makes the most sense. I mean, come on. Okay, so then I remove the spark plug out of the number one, which I've done there. Okay, already. And what I like to do is slowly turn the handle and feel what the push rods are doing so I know what stroke I'm on. Okay, so I rotate the handle slowly and I put one finger on the exhaust push rod end and the other finger on the intake push rod end, and I just keep my hand down there as I'm rotating and feel what the push rods are actually doing, what stroke I'm on. So what I'm trying to do is find top dead center on the power stroke, of course, using the 4-stroke principle. I mean, if you have your own way of doing it, that's great, but this is how I do it. That way I know for sure. So what I do is I turn the handle slowly, and at some point you'll feel the exhaust push rod start to open. Okay, as it starts to open, the cylinder starts coming up, the piston starts coming up rather, and it pushes the exhaust out, the exhaust pipes, and through the exhaust valve. Okay, then as you keep rotating, you'll feel the exhaust valve push rod starting to drop down. Okay, so now at this point the exhaust valve is closing. Okay, so at this point the piston's at top dead center. Okay, so but not on the power stroke. Okay, it's a 4-stroke engine, so that the piston reaches the top twice in the 4 strokes. Okay, so you keep turning the ratchet handle slowly. Okay, and then you'll start to feel the intake valve is opening, and as the intake valve is opening, the piston starts to travel down, and as the piston starts to travel down, it's drawing the air through the intake valve into the cylinder. Okay, until the piston gets all the way to the bottom of its stroke, and then the intake valve closes, so you'll feel the push rod going back down again. Okay, and now you're on the compression stroke, so no push rods will move, and you keep cranking the handle, the ratchet handle, slowly, and the piston will start moving up from the bottom to the top, towards top dead center, compressing the mixture in the combustion chamber until it's all the way to the very top. So as you're doing this, you're putting a screwdriver in the hole here, in the spark plug hole, so you can feel the top of the piston. So as it's slowly coming up on the compression stroke, and you start slowly turning the handle, you'll see the screwdriver will start to move. See, it's moving. Okay, you can see the slight movement on the screwdriver. So the piston is getting up towards the top of the stroke. When it gets to the top, you're at top dead center of the power stroke, because at this point, that's when your spark plug will fire, when it's at TDC, top dead center, and then burn the mixture in the combustion chamber, therefore pushing the piston down, okay, to make power. So you're trying to get it at the top, and you can see the screwdriver keeps moving. Okay, and when you get close to the top of the compression stroke, you can even shine a flashlight down and look down the spark plug hole, and you'll see the top of the piston. Okay, especially if it's a nice new shiny piston like this one. Okay, but if you just slowly, if you put one hand on the screwdriver like I'm doing, and then slowly turn the handle, you can feel it get to the very top, and then it'll start going down. Okay, and then you might want to back up a little bit. But, you know, get it to the actual top. Okay, the best you can, and you're at top dead center. And then you know that at this point, you can install your rockers and adjust the valves. And you know your valve adjustment will be accurate because you're where you need to be to make the adjustment. Okay. Okay, I placed the number 1 rocker assembly in position on the studs, and just a couple of tricks here is make sure you loosen off the adjustment nuts and back the adjustment screw out. Okay, because that way there's room enough. You're not compressing a valve. You don't want to be compressing a valve while you're trying to install your rocker assembly. Okay, so you do that. You can see the adjusters are loosened up. And the other thing you want to do is put your finger and reach around the bottom and make sure your push rod is inside of the rocker. Okay, so you're pushing that rocker down at the bottom and you're pushing the rocker in towards the middle of the engine, and you're feeling the push rod underneath to make sure the end is nicely inserted into the rocker cut. Okay? You also want to, before you start, is wiggle the push rods around a little bit before you put your rocker on, just to make sure they're all the way at the center of the mechanical lifter on the other end. Okay, and that now that you've got the bottoms 2 push rods inside of the rockers, you can push the whole block onto the studs, the whole rocker assembly onto the studs. Okay, and like that all the way down. Okay, so now it's on. All right, and again you can check. All right, so once you get the rocker down and you've got the 2 nuts installed, I'm working on that now, and those nuts, once they're torqued as per the manual, then you can do your feeler gauge rocker adjustment that you always would do with any Volkswagen. It's well covered in the manuals, and get your 0.6 of an inch clearance and lock off the lock nuts on the adjusters, and you're good. You're golden. Okay, and then you can move on to the next cylinder. Do it exactly the same way I showed you to determine top dead center. And one other thing is, when you're putting the push rods in, these aluminum ones, make sure that the far end that's in the engine, make sure they're in the center of the lifters and not hung up on a step before you install the rockers. Okay, so you want to make sure that the end that's in contact with the mechanical lifters is in the center of that lifter before you put the rocker block on. Okay, so that's the way I do my rockers to set them up properly. Now these are aluminum push rods. If you're making a big stroker engine like the 2316 up on the workbench, then you gotta, most likely you're using chrome moly steel push rods, because this one is a wider engine with spacers to accept the 80 millimeter stroke, and it has longer push rod tubes that we talked about before. So i.e. longer push rods. Then most guys are gonna buy like the Bug Pack brand push rods that you can cut and make to a size that you need for your engine. And the Bug Pack brand push rods is what I used here, and they're chrome moly steel. Okay, so when you're doing your chrome moly steel push rod adjustment, on the rockers you're using 0. Okay, if you're doing aluminum push rods, stock push rods, then of course it's 0.006. So that's 6 thou for the 1700 engine, and for the 1.8 and 2 liter engines, it's 6 thou on the intake and 8 thousandths of an inch for the exhaust valves. For your valve clearance adjustments, get yourself a nice set of Blue Point feeler gauges. That's what I use. They're great. Also, there's lots of good YouTube videos on how to set up the geometry correctly. And really what you're looking for is when the valve is halfway, like so. Basically what you do is you rotate the engine until the valve is halfway down on its travel. So you kind of can eyeball it by looking at the rocker. And as the rocker starts its way down and gets to the very bottom, you can go back halfway. So roll the engine backwards halfway and then have a look at the adjuster as it touches the tip of the valve. At that point, you should have that adjuster right at the center of the tip, in the center of the valve tip. Okay, and it should be at the same angle as the valve stem. You can use a dial indicator too to know how far the valve travels downward, how far the rocker travels downward, and then you can set it up that way using shims under the rocker bosses. So in this picture, the center line should be centered at the midpoint of the valve travel. And again in this picture, the center line should be straight at the midpoint of the valve travel. Again, check it out on the YouTube videos. This factory chart here is a specification which is asking you to do the same thing in a way, but while the valve's fully closed, as it would be when you're doing your clearance check with your feeler gauge. This is what it should look like, and is a simpler way to do it. It's the way I do it, actually. For a pretty close to stock engine, it'll work out fine, like a 1911. The whole purpose of this is to, as the valve's being pushed down by the valve adjuster, it's trying to spin the valve stem a little bit to get the valve to rotate a little bit and make the force more even up against the valve guide to lessen the amount of valve guide wear over time. All right, one side's done, so that's great news, and now we're working on the other side. I think that pretty well wraps up the video for today. One small tip is on the rocker blocks that we talked about, make sure the wider end is at the bottom, so up against the cylinder head, and the smaller end is on top. That's the top. Okay, don't put them on upside down. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you later. Okay, and don't forget to give us a like. That would be much appreciated. If I get enough interest, I'll keep going with the videos to help you through, and maybe we'll even rebuild this core engine together. So something to do is like the channel, subscribe. If I don't get enough interest, I don't think I'll carry on with it. I don't want to waste anybody's time, including my own. Okay, so have a nice day, enjoy your Type 4 experience, and we'll talk to you later.